To help us understand what we make of this, joining us now is Jaimini Bhagwati, RBI Chair Professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Dr. Bhagwati, appreciate you joining us here on the program. The Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council has put out a 12-page rebuttal to Arvind Subramanian's paper that was published by Harvard. Now, they've said many things, including calling the absurdity of Dr. Subramanian's paper to selectively ignore tax data based on the argument that the period post-2011-12 witnessed major changes in direct and indirect taxes. This is just only one of the points of concern that have been raised by the PMEAC members. Now, without getting into the PMEAC's model versus Arvind Subramanian's model, the larger question is, on the basis of the 17 indicators, high-frequency indicators, from cement sales to two-wheeler sales, tractor sales, electricity consumption, IIP data, which is everything that Arvind Subramanian has looked at, would it be fair to say that at this point in time, there is a problem with growth in India? Forget whether it's overestimated by 2 percentage points or not.
Is that question addressed to me, Shereen?
Yes, Dr. Bhagwati.
Yeah, well, to begin with, there is a little bit of background to this whole issue. I find, very frankly, Dr. Subramanian's rush to the media quite premature. But the background to all this, you might recall that there was a little bit of a brouhaha when two members of the National Statistical Commission resigned because of some issues with regard to the fact that they may not have been consulted before the Niti Aayog put out the numbers, and this was on unemployment. So, and then some other people for some time have been uncomfortable with the way GDP has been calculated ever since the new series has come out. Now, having said all that, I think it's highly premature for me, who's outside government and has no access to the raw data, nor do, very frankly, this is not my area of expertise. But my own sense is that Dr. Subramanian, as you mentioned, take 17 high-frequency indicators and you come up with certain numbers on growth. I'm a little uncomfortable, particularly with how dramatic the drop is. But having said that, as always for us, we, on the other hand, when you look at two-wheeler sales, you look at car sales, you look at exports, you look at a number of indicators, they are not doing too well, to say the least. So, but does it necessarily mean that GDP growth is at 4.5%? I don't think so. I think, you look at the NBFC crisis, there is no lending in the money markets, and RBI is standing ready to provide liquidity, but the usual stuff about solvency and liquidity and all that. So, to put it in a nutshell, I take a step back and I say it's highly premature for anyone to comment. The PMEAC is a body which has a number of experts, and I trust them not to say something without having looked at what Subramanian has said and written very carefully. My own feeling is that 4.5 sounds a little too low, given everything. Now, as you said, let's step back from the actual computations. So it sounds a bit low, and more important than that, Mr. Subramanian was till recently the Chief Economic Advisor, and I would have thought that courtesy to his former colleagues would have meant that he would have shared his findings quietly, confidentially with those those whom he knows well in the Ministry of Finance, and once they have either satisfied him or not satisfied him, then he should go public, because there is an impact on investors, because after all, he is a former CEA, he seemed to be seen an insider, plus right now he is based in some institution associated with Harvard. So the whole thing leaves one uncomfortable with the way he rushed to publish this as some kind of a scoop. On the other hand, government should be thinking in terms of how to make its whole entire process of data dissemination a little clearer and more objective in terms of the viewer. For the government, it's already objective. But to make it more credible, and I'll end with this submission through your channel to government, that kindly make the National Statistical Commission a statutory body where the members and the chairman have a fixed tenure of 5 years, and they do their work at arm's length from government, while CSO and the NSSO remain within MOSPI. These are kind of, one is a short-term reaction and one is the longer-term issue that government should address. I mean, whether government is fully justified or not in saying what it has through the PMEAC, although the PMEAC is not really government, they are after all advisors, and one would hope and wait to see what MOSPI or some other government body says about this whole issue. Not that it is required to. After all, Mr. Subramanian now is a private individual. So government is not obliged to, but in terms of its overall credibility, it should put out some of this in the public domain in its own measured, well thought out way. There is no need to rush.
You're right about the fact that for the sake of a sort of holistic approach to addressing some of the concerns that have been raised, it would perhaps be right on the part of the government to even consider, as you pointed out, giving the National Statistical Commission statutory status. But that, of course, is a decision for the government to make. But, sir, and I don't want to get into the argument whether, Arvind Subramanian's calculation is accurate or not. He's not here to explain or defend. So let me move to the other question, which perhaps is more important. We've got a budget coming up. There are going to be policy decisions that the government will now have to take. Now, Arvind Subramanian, in that paper, says the heady narrative of a guns-blazing India must cede to a more realistic one of an economy growing solidly but not spectacularly. That would perhaps accurately capture the mood of the Indian economy today, without getting into an argument of whether it's 7.5%, 7% or 6.9%. But policy prescription from here, what will the imperatives be?
This is kind of journalistic language, guns blazing and so on and so forth. I would say
no, that's his language. That's his language, not mine. That's Subramanian's language, not mine.
I know it's his language, and I take it. I heard you. I'm saying that is, I feel a little uncomfortable with that kind of language. I don't think anybody in government or anybody here in India is under any illusion that our economy is firing on all 24 cylinders or whatever it is. Everybody knows that there are a number of issues and we need to look at them carefully and closely. I would think that this is the same old things on the finance minister's plate and on the government's plate, particularly as in the run-up to the budget being presented in Parliament, which is the fiscal deficit, where inflation, as we all know, is by Indian standards quite tame. And yeah, I know there are certain warning signs coming up, but for that, and oil is relatively docile in the sense of oil prices are flat for the last month or so. So you have an environment internationally which is not too bad. On the trade front, you have some noises with the US. It's not a happy situation. Now, what does it all mean? It all means that we go back to our fundamentals. And the fundamentals are, I've already said about inflation, which is under some control. Fiscal deficit, now if your denominator we are unclear about, how do we know whether fiscal deficit is at 3.4 or 3.5 or has it gone to 3.8? By the denominator, I mean GDP, if your GDP calculations are suspect. So I would suggest that government needs to look very carefully and explain to people that they are quite comfortable with the numbers. So the same old recipes, but at the same time, the financial sector, whether it is the public sector banks, whether it is the NBFC sector, these two need to be looked at closely, both in terms of, because NBFC I mean, ILFS was an absurdity. ILFS as an NBFC should not be lending long. NBFCs should be relatively lending short.
Yeah.
That's the way markets work. While it's unfortunate that term lending institutions are disappearing or almost have disappeared. I feel sorry about that. We needed, I mean, you can say, oh, but you know, nowhere in the world do you have term lending institutions of the kind that India had. Yes, we didn't, but India is somewhat different. So we don't have to keep apologizing for the fact that we have certain kinds of institutions that don't exist in the rest of the world. So we have seen now at great pain and cost to us that term lending by even PSBs has been difficult, and I don't want to go back to RBI circulars and so on and so forth. So I think in addition to the immediate challenge of presenting a budget which is credible and which is something that the government will strive to then implement in terms of the various targets that it sets for itself, I would think that there is nothing that this particular report or article, I'm not quite sure what it is. I've just seen it in the Indian Express, and it's also available on the net, what Mr. Subramanian has written.
Well, it's
I don't
a paper.
think this is by itself.
It's a
I think what
paper.
we need to... It's a paper, but we all know, you have been tracking it very closely through your channel. What's the investment mood? How are the various indicators, not just the stock market indicators, but a range of other indicators in terms of the non-performing assets, let's say, what is the net non-performing asset situation and so on and so forth. What is the banking sector looking like? So you have looked at all that and more. And in that, you feel that there are certain areas where there are some worries. But, I mean, there is no country in the world where there are no worries. I referred very briefly to trade. I mean, you look at China, USA, we don't know where it's all going. We don't control that. Okay, GSP privileges are gone, but at the same time, so with all this,
you're absolutely right.
I don't see
every country has its own share of issues today. Yeah, it has to be a combination of things that the government will need to do. My final question to you, sir, and we've got literally 30 seconds. You know, given the fact that you know, questions have been raised not just by this latest paper that Arvind Subramanian, the former chief economic advisor, has put out, but before that as well, do you think that it would perhaps be appropriate for the government to put forward its perspective on this entire matter, for instance, in the economic survey?
You know, the ministry which is responsible for these numbers ultimately is MOSPI. And the National Statistical Commission, which is supposed to be arm's length. So I would think the economic survey, because, you know, the Ministry of Finance is the repository of a lot of information, but it's not really the place which comes out. It is the CSO, the MOSPI. RBI does its own calculations. There's no harm if you can do it within the time frame of the economic survey coming out. But I would think that don't rush it. Look at it carefully and come out with the numbers along with a package of measures which will make this whole exercise credible, not just in the eyes of the PMEAC or the government, but in the eyes of you and me. That we are not in government, but we are, how should I put it, well-wishers of the country. We are not looking to find fault with every little thing, but at the same time, we need to be convinced. We are objective observers with a view that India, we are be happy if India does well. That doesn't make us distort reality. So I would think that budget and the economic survey and all that related with it, it's coming up too soon for this entire exercise to be done in a way. You could perhaps do a partial exercise and satisfy people, because as we both discussed a moment ago, the denominator is GDP, and you can't really come up with any budget number without a credible GDP. But do something which gives some satisfaction to yourself. To yourself, meaning to government, because after all, government is to meet those budget targets. And to the extent that the GDP is being overstated, you'll end up with numbers which don't make sense, and ultimately you'll have to contend with inflation, which is a politically charged issue.
Yeah. Yes, I think it would make sense. You've captured the essence of the matter. I mean, without getting into the details of the method and the methodology used by Arvind Subramanian to make his case, the PMEAC's arguments as well. I think the layperson would like clarity and transparency from the government, and I would imagine that the first attempt has been made by the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council today to try and put out its perspective on why they believe that Arvind Subramanian's argument doesn't hold water. Dr. Bhagwati, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 with your take on this. Quick break. There's a lot more coming up on CNBC. Don't go anywhere.